The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty training range as Maria Santos swept the concrete floors of the small supply building. Her weathered hands gripped the broom handle tightly. Moving in steady rhythms, she had perfected over 3 years of working at the military facility. At 42, she had learned to find peace in simple tasks, though her mind often wandered to her son Carlos, somewhere overseas serving his second tour of duty. The sound of boots on gravel made her look up from her work. Through the window, she could see the Navy SEALs beginning their morning training exercises. These elite soldiers had become familiar faces over the months, though she rarely spoke to them beyond polite greetings. They moved with purpose and precision that reminded her of Carlos, back when he was young and eager to serve his country. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison checked his gear one final time as his team prepared for what should have been a routine marksmanship exercise. The 34-year-old SEAL had been through countless training sessions, but something felt different today. Perhaps it was the intelligence reports filtering in from overseas, or maybe it was the weight of knowing his team would deploy again soon. Either way, he pushed the feeling aside and focused on the task ahead. "Range is clear," called out his spotter, Petty Officer Davis. "Wind's calm, conditions are perfect." Jake nodded, settling into position behind his rifle. The Barrett M82 felt familiar in his hands, an extension of his will and training. At 600 yards, the target seemed impossibly small, but years of practice had made such shots routine. He controlled his breathing, found his natural respiratory pause, and began the familiar ritual of precise shooting. Maria continued her sweeping, the rhythmic sound of bristles on concrete creating a peaceful backdrop to the distant crack of rifle fire. She had grown accustomed to the noise over the years, finding it oddly comforting. It meant the soldiers were training, preparing to keep others safe. It meant they might come home to their families, just as she prayed Carlos would. The cleaning supplies needed restocking, so Maria made her way to the storage room at the back of the building. The small space was cramped but organized, shelves lined with industrial cleaners, paper products, and maintenance equipment. She had personally arranged everything to maximize efficiency, taking pride in keeping the facility spotless for the brave men and women who trained there. As she gathered supplies, Maria's thoughts drifted to the letter she had received from Carlos the previous week. His words were carefully chosen, revealing little about his actual circumstances, but conveying enough for a mother's heart to worry. He spoke of missing her cooking, of dreaming about their small garden behind the house, of counting days until he could visit again. Between the lines, she read exhaustion and stress that no 24-year-old should carry. Jake's first shot hit center mass, exactly where he had aimed. The satisfaction of a perfect shot never grew old, but today it felt mechanical, routine. His mind kept wandering to the mission briefing they would receive later that afternoon. Rumors suggested their next deployment would be more dangerous than usual, though specifics remained classified. "Beautiful shot," Davis commented, adjusting his spotting scope. "Winds picking up slightly from the east." Jake made the necessary adjustment and prepared for his second shot. In the distance, he could see Maria through the supply building window, methodically going about her work. He had noticed her before, during training exercises, always focused on her tasks, always maintaining the facility with quiet dignity. There was something in her manner that reminded him of his own mother back in Ohio, the same steady determination and understated strength. Maria emerged from the storage room with her arms full of cleaning supplies. The morning was progressing well, and she hoped to finish the building before lunch. Her supervisor had mentioned the possibility of overtime work later in the week, which would help with the bills that seemed to accumulate faster than her modest salary could address. Every extra dollar meant more care packages she could send to Carlos, more ways to show her love across the vast distance that separated them. The sound of helicopters in the distance made her pause in her work. Military aircraft were common around the base, but these sounded different somehow, more urgent. Through the window, she could see personnel moving with increased purpose, though she could not determine why. In her 3 years at the facility, Maria had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when routine training shifted into something more serious. Jake heard the helicopters too and felt his stomach tighten. Emergency flights during training exercises usually meant one of two things: either a training accident requiring medical evacuation or real-world events that demanded immediate response. He maintained his focus on the target, but his awareness expanded to include the changing atmosphere around the range. The radio crackled to life with urgent communication between the flight control tower and incoming aircraft. Though the words were indistinct at this distance, the tone was unmistakably serious. Jake's team exchanged glances, each reading the same concern in the other's faces. Their years of experience had taught them to recognize when training might suddenly become reality. Maria noticed the change in the SEALs' behavior through the window. Where moments before they had been relaxed and methodical in their training, now they moved with heightened alertness. She had seen this transformation once before on the day news broke of a terrorist attack overseas. The memory sent a chill down her spine as she thought of Carlos, wondering if he was safe, if he was warm, if he had eaten enough that day. The building's landline telephone rang, startling Maria from her thoughts. She rarely received calls at work, and for a moment she hesitated before answering. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, belonging to someone from the base communications center. "Mrs. Santos, we need you to remain in the building and away from windows until further notice. This is a precautionary measure, and someone will update you shortly." Before Maria could ask questions, the line went dead. Her hands trembled slightly as she replaced the receiver, though she was not sure if the trembling came from fear or simply the adrenaline of unexpected news. In her experience, precautionary measures on military bases were rarely taken lightly. Jake received similar instructions through his team's radio communication. An unspecified threat had been detected in the surrounding area, and all training exercises were to be suspended immediately. Personnel were to maintain their current positions until the all-clear signal was given. The lack of specific information was itself telling. It meant the threat was credible enough to disrupt operations, but unclear enough to require caution rather than evacuation. Through his rifle scope, Jake could see the supply building where Maria worked. He wondered if she understood the gravity of the situation, if she knew that her safety might depend on decisions made by people she would never meet. The thought bothered him more than he expected. Civilians working on military facilities often became invisible to the personnel around them, their contributions taken for granted until something like this reminded everyone of their vulnerability. Maria moved away from the windows as instructed, though she could not resist one final glance at the training range. The SEALs remained in position, but their casual demeanor had vanished completely. Whatever was happening, it was serious enough to transform elite soldiers from trainees into guardians in a matter of minutes. The supply room suddenly felt smaller than usual, its familiar walls now seeming like barriers rather than boundaries. Maria had never considered herself claustrophobic, but the combination of uncertainty and confinement created an unexpected anxiety. She found herself thinking of Carlos again, wondering if he had ever felt this same helpless waiting in dangerous situations, knowing that his safety depended on factors beyond his control. Jake's radio crackled again with updates from the command center. Intelligence reports suggested possible hostile activity in the surrounding area, though details remained vague. His team was directed to maintain overwatch positions, while other units conducted a sweep of the perimeter. The familiar weight of his rifle provided comfort, but he could not shake his awareness of the civilian worker trapped in a nearby building. Time seemed to move differently during moments of potential crisis. Minutes felt like hours as Maria waited for updates that never came. She found herself cleaning the same surfaces repeatedly, needing the familiar motions to calm her nerves. The simple act of maintaining order in her environment provided a sense of control when everything else felt uncertain. The helicopters had landed somewhere beyond her view, disgorging personnel and equipment for whatever operation was now underway. Maria could hear vehicles moving in the distance, their engines growing louder and then fading as they dispersed across the base. Each sound created new questions in her mind, new scenarios that ranged from routine exercises to genuine emergencies. Jake watched through his scope as security teams established checkpoints around the facility. Their movements were professional and efficient, but the speed of their deployment suggested this was not a drill. His finger rested lightly on his rifle's trigger guard, not quite ready to engage, but prepared to respond instantly if the situation escalated. In the supply building, Maria sat quietly in the storage room, surrounded by the tools of her trade, but feeling utterly disconnected from the normalcy they represented. The broom leaning against the wall seemed like an artifact from a simpler time, when her greatest concern had been finishing her work before lunch. Now she found herself praying for the safety of people she barely knew, for soldiers whose names she might never learn, and for her son Carlos, wherever he might be facing dangers she could not imagine. The radio chatter in Jake's earpiece increased in frequency and urgency, though much of it remained coded in language designed to prevent unauthorized listeners from understanding the situation. What he could determine was that the threat was real, immediate, and potentially deadly. His training kicked in completely now, suppressing personal concerns and focusing entirely on mission requirements. As the morning stretched into afternoon, Maria began to understand that this was no brief inconvenience. Whatever was happening would not be resolved quickly, and she might be confined to the building for hours. The realization brought both fear and resignation, emotions she recognized from the endless nights of worrying about Carlos during his deployments, waiting for news, hoping for the best, and preparing mentally for possibilities too terrible to voice aloud. Jake's position gave him a clear view of multiple approach routes to the facility, making him a key part of the defensive perimeter. The responsibility felt both familiar and heavy, knowing that other people's lives might depend on his vigilance and skill. In his peripheral vision, he could still see the supply building where Maria waited, a reminder that protection meant more than completing missions. It meant ensuring that innocent people could continue their quiet, important work in safety. The sun reached its zenith as the first phase of what would become a very long day drew to a close. Neither Maria nor Jake could have imagined how profoundly their lives were about to intersect, or how the simple act of sweeping floors and practicing marksmanship would soon become secondary to survival and unexpected heroism. The first crack of enemy gunfire shattered the afternoon quiet like a thunderclap, sending birds exploding from nearby trees and transforming the peaceful training facility into a combat zone. Maria dropped to the floor instinctively as bullets shattered the supply building's windows, glass cascading around her like deadly rain. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she crawled toward the storage room. Away from the exposed windows were moments before she had been calmly organizing cleaning supplies. Jake's training took over instantly. The distant muzzle flashes told him everything he needed to know about the enemy's position, approximately 800 yards to the northeast. His spotter Davis was already calling out coordinates and wind corrections while Jake settled behind his rifle with the fluid precision of thousands of practice sessions. But this time the targets shooting back were not paper silhouettes. Contact northeast, 800 yards, multiple shooters. Davis spoke rapidly into his radio while maintaining visual on the enemy position. Civilian in the supply building, requesting immediate support. Through his scope, Jake could see at least 3 hostile shooters positioned behind a small rise in the terrain. They had chosen their location well, with natural cover and multiple escape routes. More concerning was their apparent knowledge of the facility's layout, suggesting this was not a random attack, but a carefully planned assault. Maria pressed herself against the storage room wall, her breathing rapid and shallow. The sound of automatic weapons fire was unlike anything she had experienced, even having lived near military bases for years. Each burst seemed to shake the building's walls, and she could hear debris falling somewhere in the main room. Her thoughts immediately went to Carlos, wondering if this was what he experienced regularly, this terror that made every heartbeat feel like it might be the last. The enemy fire was accurate and sustained, indicating trained fighters rather than opportunistic attackers. Jake watched through his scope as bullets struck the concrete walls around the supply building, sending up small clouds of dust with each impact. The shooters were deliberately targeting the building where Maria was trapped, though he could not determine whether they knew about her presence or were simply trying to eliminate potential observation posts. Base, this is Overwatch 1. Jake spoke into his radio while maintaining his sight picture. We have hostile contact, civilian in danger, requesting permission to engage. The response came back immediately. Overwatch 1, you're clear to engage. Neutralize the threat. Jake's first shot took down the leftmost shooter instantly, the .50 caliber bullet covering 800 yards in less than a second. But the remaining enemies immediately shifted position, disappearing behind rocks and vegetation while continuing to fire toward the supply building. Their tactical movement confirmed Jake's assessment that these were experienced fighters, not amateurs. Maria heard the distinctive boom of Jake's rifle and somehow understood that help was fighting back. The knowledge provided little comfort as bullets continued to strike the building around her. She found herself thinking of her morning routine, how normal everything had seemed just hours ago. The broom she had been using still lay in the main room, abandoned when the attack began, a symbol of the ordinary life that now seemed impossibly distant. Davis spotted movement as the remaining shooters attempted to flank toward better positions. Two contacts moving east, trying to get an angle on the building, he reported. The enemy's tactics were becoming clear. Pin down or eliminate any defenders while advancing to better positions, possibly to take hostages or plant explosives. Jake tracked the moving figures through his scope, but they were using terrain and vegetation expertly, appearing only briefly before disappearing again. This cat-and-mouse game was exactly what his training had prepared him for, but the stakes felt different with a civilian trapped in the building the enemy was targeting. Every second of delay potentially meant greater danger for Maria. The radio crackled with reports from other positions around the base. Additional security teams were moving to intercept, but they were still several minutes away. In combat situations, minutes could feel like hours, and Jake knew that the immediate responsibility for protecting Maria fell to him and his spotter. The weight of that responsibility settled over him like a familiar but unwelcome burden. Inside the storage room, Maria tried to make herself as small as possible while remaining aware of her surroundings. She could hear different types of gunfire now, distinguishing between the sharp cracks of incoming rounds and the deeper booms that she somehow knew came from defenders. The battle was real, happening around her, and she was completely helpless to affect its outcome. Jake's second shot missed as the target dove behind cover just as he squeezed the trigger. The enemy fighters were learning his position and timing, making themselves harder targets with each exchange. Davis was already calling out a new position for one of the remaining shooters, but the angle was challenging, requiring Jake to adjust his position while remaining concealed from enemy observation. Contact moving to secondary position, Davis reported, tracking a figure moving through a drainage ditch toward the facility. He's trying to get within grenade range of the building. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. If the enemy fighters reached close range, they could use explosives or simply storm the supply building where Maria was trapped. Jake's precision rifle was perfect for long-range engagement, but would be less effective if the fight moved to close quarters. He needed to stop the advancing fighters before they could complete their flanking maneuver. Maria heard footsteps running across gravel outside the building, though she could not determine if they belonged to defenders or attackers. The uncertainty was almost worse than the obvious danger, forcing her mind to create scenarios that ranged from rescue to capture. She found herself whispering prayers she had not spoken since childhood, bargaining with a god she was not sure was listening. Jake took his third shot at a figure moving between cover positions, but again the target disappeared just before his bullet arrived. The enemy fighters were clearly experienced in dealing with sniper fire, using techniques that suggested military training. This realization added another layer of concern to an already dangerous situation, as trained fighters would be more unpredictable and resourceful than common criminals. The sound of vehicles approaching provided both hope and anxiety for Maria. Were these reinforcements coming to help, or additional enemies joining the attack? Her limited view from the storage room window showed only a small section of sky, offering no information about the developing situation outside. The isolation felt complete, as if she existed in a tiny bubble surrounded by chaos she could hear, but not see. Davis spotted the muzzle flash from the advancing enemy fighter and immediately called corrections to Jake. 200 yards left of your last shot. Range 850. He's moving fast through the drainage area. The spotter's voice remained calm and professional despite the intensity of the situation, a testament to the training that prepared SEALs for exactly these circumstances. Jake adjusted his aim and fired, this time connecting with the advancing fighter and stopping the flanking attempt. But the victory was temporary, as the remaining enemy immediately shifted tactics again, laying down suppressive fire that forced Jake and Davis to take cover behind their position. Bullets cracked overhead, some striking the concrete barrier that protected them. The incoming fire was accurate enough to keep the SEAL team pinned down for crucial seconds, during which Maria could hear movement much closer to her building. Someone was running across the gravel area directly outside, their footsteps distinct from the distant sounds of the larger battle. Her heart rate increased even further as she realized the fight was moving toward her position. Jake emerged from cover as soon as the suppressive fire paused, immediately acquiring the remaining visible target through his scope. But before he could fire, movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. A figure was approaching the supply building from the blind side, using the structure itself as cover from Jake's position. The tactical situation was becoming impossible to control from a single overwatch position. "Davis, call for immediate support to the supply building," Jake ordered while tracking the new threat. "Someone's about to reach the civilian's position." The spotter immediately began transmitting urgent requests for backup, while Jake tried to get an angle on the approaching fighter. But the building's position created a dead zone where enemy fighters could approach without exposing themselves to his rifle. For the first time since the engagement began, Jake felt the cold touch of potential failure. Maria heard voices outside the building, speaking in a language she did not recognize. The tone was urgent and tactical, clearly coordinating some kind of action. Her limited Spanish and English provided no help in understanding the words, but the aggressive cadence needed no translation. These were not the voices of rescuers. The supply building's main door rattled as someone tested it from outside. Maria had locked it automatically when the gunfire began, a meaningless gesture that now seemed pathetically inadequate. The door was sturdy, but not designed to withstand determined assault, and she could hear someone examining it, perhaps looking for the best way to force entry. Jake made a desperate decision, abandoning his prepared position and moving to get a different angle on the supply building. The movement exposed him to potential enemy fire, but staying in place meant certain danger for Maria. Davis provided covering fire, while Jake repositioned, understanding without words that the mission priorities had shifted from defensive overwatch to active protection of the civilian. The new position gave Jake a partial view of the supply building's entrance, but the angle was poor and the range was longer than optimal for precision shooting. He could see a figure crouch near the door, working with some kind of tool or explosive device. The sight sent adrenaline surging through his system as he realized Maria had perhaps seconds before the enemy breached her sanctuary. Through the storage room wall, Maria could hear metallic sounds that suggested someone was working on the door lock or hinges. The building's construction was solid, but not military-grade, designed to keep weather and theft out rather than armed attackers. She looked around desperately for anything that might serve as a weapon or barricade, but cleaning supplies offered little in the way of defensive options. Jake's shot at the figure by the door was rushed and missed, the bullet striking concrete inches from the target. The near miss caused the enemy fighter to duck and move, but also alerted him to the sniper's new position. Return fire immediately began striking near Jake's location, forcing him to adjust again while precious seconds ticked away. The sound of splintering would told Maria that the door was giving way. Her options had narrowed to hiding and hoping to remain undetected, though the storage room offered limited concealment. She pressed herself into the corner behind a shelf of supplies, trying to control her breathing while her mind raced through impossible scenarios of escape or survival. Jake could see that the door was about to fail completely. In seconds, enemy fighters would have access to the building where Maria was trapped. His long-range rifle was powerful, but not precise enough for the close-quarters shooting that might be required. The tactical situation demanded a different approach, one that went against every principle of sniper employment, but might be the only option for protecting the innocent woman whose morning had been shattered by violence she never deserved. The door exploded inward with a crash that sent splinters flying across the supply building's main floor. Maria pressed herself deeper into the storage room corner, her heart hammering so loudly she feared it might give away her position. Through the partially open storage room door, she could see armed figures moving through the main area, their movements professional and coordinated as they searched for occupants. Jake watched through his scope as 3 enemy fighters entered the building, their weapons raised and ready. From his distant position, he could not effectively engage targets inside the structure without risking harm to Maria. The long-range precision rifle that made him deadly at 800 yards became a liability in close-quarter situations where millimeter accuracy meant the difference between neutralizing threats and creating friendly fire incidents. Multiple hostiles inside the building with a civilian, Davis reported urgently into his radio. Overwatch cannot engage without endangering the protected person. The enemy fighters were systematic in their search, clearing the main room with practiced efficiency before moving toward the storage areas where Maria was hidden. Their voices carried clearly through the building, speaking in rapid, clipped phrases that suggested military training and recent combat experience. These were not random attackers, but organized fighters executing a deliberate plan. Maria could hear boots on concrete getting closer to her hiding place. The storage room had seemed like sanctuary when the attack began, but now it felt like a trap with no exit. She found herself thinking of Carlos again, wondering if he had ever been in similar situations, cornered and helpless while armed enemies searched for him. The thought gave her strength she did not know she possessed. Jake made a decision that violated every principle of sniper doctrine he had ever learned. Instead of remaining in his overwatch position, he began moving toward the supply building, carrying his heavy rifle and knowing he was abandoning the tactical advantage of distance and concealment. Davis understood immediately and began providing covering fire to mask Jake's movement. "What's your plan?" Davis called out while engaging the remaining external threats. "Close-range precision," Jake replied tersely, his breathing already becoming labored from the sprint across open ground while carrying 50 pounds of equipment. The Barrett rifle was designed for long-range work, not the kind of close-quarters shooting he was about to attempt, but it was the weapon he had available. Inside the building, the search was narrowing. Maria could hear the enemy fighters opening doors, moving furniture, and systematically eliminating hiding places. Their approach was methodical and patient, suggesting they were not under immediate pressure from outside forces. The realization that help might not arrive in time forced Maria to consider options she had never imagined needing. One of the fighters was now directly outside the storage room, his shadow visible under the door. Maria held her breath and pressed herself as far into the corner as possible, trying to become invisible behind the shelving unit. The handle turned slowly, and she knew her hiding place was about to be discovered. Time seemed to slow as the door began to open. Jake reached the building's exterior wall, his chest heaving from the sprint across the training range. Through the broken windows, he could see movement inside, but not clear shots at the enemy fighters. The situation required him to enter the building and engage at close range, transforming a precision sniper into a room-clearing specialist with equipment designed for the opposite purpose. The storage room door swung open fully, revealing the enemy fighter silhouetted against the light from the main room. Maria remained frozen in her corner, hoping desperately that the shadows and shelving would conceal her presence. For a moment, the fighters seemed to look directly at her, and she was certain discovery was inevitable. Her mind began preparing for consequences she could not bear to consider. Jake entered the supply building through one of the shattered windows, his rifle ready, but knowing the weapon's limitations in the confined space. The Barrett's length made it difficult to maneuver in tight quarters, and its power meant that any shot would likely overpenetrate walls and potentially endanger Maria, even if it successfully neutralized threats. The enemy fighter in the storage room stepped inside, sweeping the space with his weapon. Maria could see his boots inches from her position, could hear his breathing as he searched methodically through the small room. Her own breathing had become so shallow that she felt dizzy, but she dared not take a deeper breath for fear the sound would betray her. From his position near the main room entrance, Jake could see 2 of the 3 enemy fighters, but still had no clear shots that would not endanger the civilian. The angles were wrong, the distances too close for his weapon's optimal employment. He needed to create opportunities that would allow precision engagement without collateral damage. The fighter searching the storage room called out to his companions, apparently reporting that the space appeared empty. Maria felt a surge of hope that her concealment had succeeded, but the man continued his search, moving boxes and equipment with increasing thoroughness. Discovery seemed inevitable, just delayed by minutes rather than prevented. Jake decided on a desperate gambit that would draw the enemy fighters away from Maria's hiding place, while creating engagement opportunities for his rifle. He deliberately made noise in the main room, kicking over a metal bucket, and allowing his position to be detected. The tactical disadvantage was enormous, but it was the only way to protect the civilian. The sound of metal clanging in the main room immediately drew the attention of all 3 enemy fighters. The man searching the storage room abandoned his methodical examination and moved toward the sound, his weapon ready for engagement. Maria heard his footsteps retreating, but dared not move from her hiding place. understanding that the danger had intensified rather than diminished. Jake positioned himself behind a concrete support pillar that would provide some protection while allowing him to engage the approaching enemies. The Barrett rifle felt unwieldy in the confined space, but its massive stopping power would end threats instantly if he could achieve clean hits. The margin for error was essentially zero. The first enemy fighter appeared around a corner, his automatic weapon sweeping for targets. Jake's shot took him center mass, the .50 caliber bullet's impact throwing the man backward and down. But the muzzle flash and thunderous report in the enclosed space had announced Jake's position to the remaining threats while temporarily compromising his own vision and hearing. Return fire from the other two fighters forced Jake to take cover completely behind the pillar as bullets struck concrete around his position. The enemy fighters were now aware they faced a single opponent with a precision rifle, and they began coordinating their approach to exploit his weapon's limitations in close-quarters combat. Maria heard the massive gunshot and knew instinctively that help had arrived, though she could not determine who was fighting whom. The storage room had become her world, a tiny space where she waited for others to decide her fate through violence she could hear, but not see. Her faith in eventual rescue warred with the immediate terror of being trapped in an active firefight. Jake realized that his rifle's length prevented him from effectively clearing corners or engaging multiple targets in rapid sequence. The weapon that made him supremely deadly at long range had become a liability in room-to-room fighting. But changing weapons was not an option. He had to work with what he carried. The enemy fighters were trying to flank his position, moving through the building in opposite directions to catch him in crossfire. Jake could track their movement by sound, but could not engage both simultaneously. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, and he knew that time favored the enemy fighters who were more appropriately equipped for close-quarters battle. One fighter attempted to rush Jake's position while the other provided covering fire. Jake's shot at the rushing figure was rushed and caught the target in the shoulder rather than center mass, spinning him around but not stopping him completely. The wounded fighter continued his advance, now with nothing to lose and everything to gain from closing distance. The wounded enemy fighter rounded the pillar faster than Jake could cycle his bolt and reacquire target. For a crucial moment, both men faced each other at point-blank range, the sniper with his unwieldy precision rifle, and the fighter with a compact assault weapon ideally suited for the situation. Training and desperation met in a collision that would determine not only their fates, but Maria's as well. Jake abandoned conventional rifle employment and used the Barrett like a club, its weight and solid construction making it an effective bludgeon at contact distance. The enemy fighter's weapon discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as Jake's improvised attack connected, but the sound drew the remaining hostile toward their position. Maria heard the scuffle in the main room and understood that life-or-death combat was occurring just a yard from her hiding place. The sounds were immediate and visceral, completely unlike the distant exchanges of gunfire that had marked the beginning of the attack. Someone was fighting for her survival, risking everything to protect a woman whose name they might not even know. Jake retrieved his rifle and quickly moved to a new position as the final enemy fighter approached. The tactical situation had simplified to a deadly game of hide and seek in a small building, with both men knowing that the next engagement would likely be the last. Jake's advantages were his weapon's stopping power and his training. The enemy's advantages were superior close-quarters equipment and intimate knowledge of the building's layout. The final confrontation was building toward an inevitable climax that would determine whether Maria's ordinary morning at work would end in rescue or tragedy. In the storage room, she continued to wait and pray, understanding that strangers were risking everything to protect her, but powerless to influence the outcome of their sacrifice. Jake heard movement from multiple directions and realized that backup had finally arrived. Additional friendly forces were entering the building, but in the confusion of close-quarters combat, identification of friend versus foe became critical. The last thing he wanted was a blue-on-blue incident that would endanger the very people coming to help. The sound of coordinated movement and professional communication told Maria that the tide of battle was shifting. Military voices were calling out positions and confirmations, the organized responses of trained personnel, rather than the clipped urgency of attackers. For the first time since the assault began, she allowed herself to believe that survival was possible. The final enemy fighter was cornered but desperate, and desperate men with military training were extraordinarily dangerous. Jake could hear him moving through the building's rear section, probably looking for escape routes or a position from which to make a last stand. The arrival of backup forces had changed the tactical picture, but the situation remained volatile with Maria still trapped in her hiding place. Federal forces, identify yourself, came the clear command from the building's entrance as additional SEALs entered with proper room-clearing procedures. Morrison, SEAL Team 5, one civilian in the storage room, one hostile remaining in the rear section. Jake called back, relief flooding through him as he realized he was no longer fighting alone. The professional coordination of trained operators immediately took over the chaotic situation. Hand signals and whispered communications replaced the random violence of individual combat as the SEAL team began systematic clearing procedures designed to minimize risk to all friendly personnel, including Maria. In the storage room, Maria heard new voices speaking in calm, organized tones that carried authority and confidence. These were different from both the enemy fighters and the desperate struggle she had heard moments before. Hope began to replace terror as she understood that professional help had arrived, though she remained motionless in her hiding place until someone specifically told her it was safe to move. The remaining enemy fighter had barricaded himself in a small office at the building's rear, using an overturned desk as cover while maintaining a clear field of fire toward the main room. His position was tactically sound but ultimately hopeless, as he had no exit routes and limited ammunition. The SEAL team's approach would be methodical and professional, designed to end the situation with minimal additional risk. Contact rear office, one hostile barricaded, reported the team leader as his men took positions around the building's interior. Civilian location confirmed in storage room. Need to maintain isolation until area is secure. Jake provided details about the building's layout and the enemy fighter's probable position based on his earlier observations. His heavy sniper rifle was finally appropriate for the situation again, as the team could use its precision and stopping power to end the standoff without endangering Maria or the clearing personnel. The enemy fighter was intelligent enough to understand the situation, but desperate enough to continue fighting rather than surrender. Sporadic gunfire from his position kept the SEAL team from advancing directly, but also revealed his exact location and remaining ammunition levels. The professionals were content to wait and let time work in their favor rather than rushing into unnecessary casualties. Maria listened to the tactical communications and began to understand that the immediate danger was passing, though the situation was not yet completely resolved. The voices around her carried confidence and competence that contrasted sharply with her own helplessness. She remained hidden, but felt the psychological weight of terror beginning to lift as professional protectors took control. The team leader made the decision to end the standoff with precision rather than time. Jake was directed to a position where he could engage the barricaded fighter through the office window, while minimizing risk to clearing personnel. The Barrett rifle's power would eliminate the threat instantly, ending the danger to everyone in the building. Window shot, clean background, take it when ready, came the authorization that Jake had been waiting for. Through his scope, Jake could see the enemy fighter's position clearly. The man was wounded, cornered, and probably running low on ammunition, but still capable of causing significant harm if the situation continued. Jake controlled his breathing, found his natural respiratory pause, and executed the shot that would finally end the assault on the supply building. The silence that followed was profound and strange after hours of gunfire and violence. Maria heard footsteps approaching her storage room, but different from before, measured and careful rather than predatory. Professional voices were calling out room clearances and confirmations that the building was secure. "Ma'am, this is the United States Navy. You're safe now. We need you to stay exactly where you are while we complete our security check, and then we'll come get you." The voice was calm, reassuring, and carried absolute authority. Maria felt tears she had been holding back begin to flow as the reality of rescue sank in. She was alive, she was safe, and people had risked their lives to protect her even though she was just a civilian worker whose biggest contribution was keeping the floors clean. Jake emerged from his position as the building was declared secure, his rifle finally slung across his back rather than ready for engagement. The weight of the weapon seemed different now, heavier somehow, as if the violence it had dispensed in protecting Maria had added mass to its physical presence. His hands were steady, but his mind was beginning to process what had just occurred. The SEAL team moved with practiced efficiency to secure Maria's extraction from the storage room. 2 operators positioned themselves to provide security, while a third approached her hiding place with calm reassurance. Their movements were gentle but professional, understanding that she had experienced trauma that would take time to process fully. "Ma'am, I'm Petty Officer Davis. You did everything right by staying hidden and quiet. We're going to help you out of there now, and then we'll get you somewhere safe where medical personnel can check you over." Maria emerged from behind the shelving unit on shaking legs, her hands trembling as the accumulated stress of the morning finally began to release. The storage room that had been her prison now seemed impossibly small, and she wondered how she had managed to remain hidden in such a confined space for so long. Jake was waiting in the main room as Maria was escorted from her hiding place. Their eyes met for the first time, the civilian worker and the SEAL sniper whose lives had become intertwined by violence and circumstance. Neither spoke immediately, but something passed between them that acknowledged the shared experience of survival and protection. "Thank you," Maria said simply, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying enormous weight. Jake nodded, understanding that no elaborate response was necessary or appropriate. The gratitude in her eyes was more meaningful than any medal or commendation he had ever received. This was why he served, why he trained, why he accepted the risks that came with being a protector of innocent people who deserved to live their lives in peace. The medical personnel who examined Maria found her physically unharmed, but emotionally shaken, exactly what would be expected from someone who had survived several hours under direct threat. Her vital signs were elevated but stable, and her responses indicated that she had maintained remarkable composure under extraordinary stress. "Your son would be very proud of how you handled yourself today," one of the medics commented after Maria had mentioned Carlos during her evaluation. The observation brought fresh tears, but these were different from the terror-induced crying of earlier. These were tears of relief, gratitude, and pride that she had indeed survived something that would have broken many people. She had not just endured. She had maintained dignity and courage when everything around her had descended into chaos. Jake provided a detailed after-action report to his commanding officer, describing the tactical situation, his decisions, and the outcome. The unusual circumstances of abandoning long-range overwatch to engage in close-quarters combat would require explanation and justification, but the successful protection of civilian life provided clear validation for his choices. "You realize you violated about 12 different procedures today," his commander observed during the debriefing. "Yes, sir. I also realize that Mrs. Santos is going home to her family tonight because of those violations." The commander's expression softened slightly. "That's the right answer, Morrison. Sometimes the mission requires adaptability that goes beyond standard operating procedures. Your judgment was sound, and the outcome justified your methods." Maria was finally allowed to call her supervisor and arrange to go home early, though she doubted she would be able to sleep or function normally for several days. The familiar world of cleaning supplies and maintenance schedules seemed distant and surreal compared to the violence she had just survived. Everything would be different now, though she could not yet articulate how or why. As she prepared to leave the facility, Maria saw Jake one more time near the medical station where both had been processed and cleared. The big rifle that had protected her was secured in a case, its deadly purpose temporarily dormant, but ready to serve again when needed. The man who had carried it looked tired, but satisfied, the expression of someone who had accomplished exactly what he had set out to do. "I have a son overseas," Maria told him, though she was not sure why she felt compelled to share this information. "Carlos. He's 24, serving his second tour." Jake understood immediately why she was telling him this. It connected her to the military community in a way that went beyond her civilian job, made her more than just a worker who needed protection. She was a military mother, part of the family of people who served and sacrificed for something larger than themselves. "He'll come home," Jake said with quiet confidence. "Men like Carlos, with mothers like you, they find ways to come home." The simple exchange encapsulated everything that mattered about the day's events. Protection was not just about tactics, and weapons and professional training, though all of those were essential. It was about preserving the connections between people who loved each other, ensuring that mothers could continue worrying about their sons, and that those sons had homes to return to when their service was complete. Maria left the facility that afternoon as a different person than she had been that morning. The experience had changed her understanding of vulnerability and strength, of ordinary people and extraordinary circumstances, of the thin line between safety and danger that exists in every moment of every day. She would never again take for granted the simple act of sweeping floors in peace. Jake watched her go, knowing that their paths would probably never cross again, but that the memory of this day would remain with both of them forever. He had used his specialized skills to protect someone who needed protection, fulfilling the fundamental purpose that had drawn him to military service. The satisfaction was deeper and more lasting than any tactical success he had previously achieved. The facility returned to normal operations within hours, the physical damage repaired, and the security procedures updated to prevent similar incidents. But the human impact of the day's events would resonate far longer, changing everyone involved in subtle but permanent ways that would influence their perspectives on service, sacrifice, and the profound responsibility that comes with protecting innocent life. 3 months after the attack, Maria stood in the same supply building where she had nearly lost her life. But everything felt different now. The windows had been replaced with bulletproof glass, new security systems monitored every entrance, and additional safety protocols governed civilian access to the facility. Yet the most profound changes were not in the building's physical structure, but in Maria herself and her understanding of courage, resilience, and human connection. The nightmares had been intense during the first weeks following the incident. Maria would wake in her small apartment, heart pounding, reliving those hours of terror when armed strangers had hunted for her while she cowered behind cleaning supplies. Sleep became elusive, and simple sounds like car doors slamming or helicopters flying overhead would trigger anxiety that left her shaking and nauseous. But something unexpected had emerged from the trauma. Letters began arriving at the facility, forwarded through official channels from military personnel who had heard about the attack. Soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen from around the world wrote to express their gratitude to the civilian worker who had shown such courage under fire. Many shared their own experiences of fear and survival, creating a community of support that Maria had never imagined existed. Jake had returned to active duty rotation immediately after the incident, but he had written to Maria through official channels to check on her recovery. His letter was brief and professional, but it conveyed genuine concern for her well-being and respect for the courage she had demonstrated. The correspondence had continued sporadically, creating an unexpected friendship between the elite warrior and the civilian worker whose lives had intersected so dramatically. I think about that day differently now, Maria had written in one of her responses. Not as something that happened to me, but as something I survived because people like you were willing to risk everything to protect someone like me. It makes me understand Carlos's service in a completely different way. The mention of her son had proven prophetic in ways she could not have anticipated. Carlos had been notified of the attack on his mother through official channels, and the news had affected him profoundly. His next letter home carried an emotional weight that had been absent from his previous communications, acknowledgement of how much his service meant to people like his mother who supported the military community through their quiet, essential work. Mom, I always thought I was protecting strangers, Carlos had written. Now I understand that I'm protecting people like you, who make it possible for warriors to do their jobs. Every person in every supply room, every maintenance worker, every civilian who keeps the machinery running is part of what we're defending. You're not just my mother. You're one of the reasons all of this matters. The perspective shift had transformed Maria's understanding of her own role in the military community. She was no longer just a civilian employee earning a paycheck by maintaining facilities. She was an integral part of a larger mission that connected her work to global security and the safety of people she would never meet. The simple act of sweeping floors had taken on significance she had never recognized. Jake's deployment had taken him to a classified location overseas, but his letters continued to arrive irregularly through military postal services. His writing revealed a thoughtful, introspective man who took seriously the responsibility of protecting others and who had been changed by the experience of defending Maria as much as she had been changed by being defended. "I've been in firefights before," he had written, "but this was different. Usually, the people we're protecting are abstract, theoretical. You were real, immediate, and completely innocent. It reminded me why precision matters, why training matters, why every shot has to count. You made the mission personal in a way that improved my performance and my focus." The facility's commanding officer had arranged for Maria to receive a civilian service commendation for her conduct during the attack, recognizing her composure and cooperation under extreme duress. The ceremony was small and private, but it marked an important acknowledgement that civilian personnel were not just employees but integral members of the military community whose contributions extended far beyond their job descriptions. Maria had used the attention from the attack to advocate for better security training and support resources for civilian workers on military installations. Her suggestions, born from first-hand experience of vulnerability, have been taken seriously and implemented across multiple facilities. The changes would protect other workers who found themselves in similar situations, transforming her trauma into meaningful improvements for an entire community. The psychological counseling provided by the military had been more helpful than Maria had expected. The therapist, a former combat veteran herself, understood the unique aspects of surviving violence and had guided Maria through processing not just the immediate trauma, but the broader implications of how the experience had changed her worldview and self-perception. "You've discovered something about yourself that most people never have to learn," the counselor had explained. "You now know how you respond under extreme pressure, and the answer is that you respond well. That knowledge becomes part of your identity and your confidence going forward." It's a terrible way to learn something positive about yourself, but the learning is real and valuable. Jake's most recent letter had included news that his deployment was ending and that he would be returning to the same base where they had met. The prospect of seeing him again created mixed emotions for Maria, combining gratitude and friendship with reminders of the worst day of her life. She was not sure how she would react to seeing the rifle that had saved her life or the man who had risked everything to protect her. Carlos had also written with unexpected news. His unit was being reassigned, and he would be returning stateside within 6 months for the first time since the attack. The timing seemed meaningful, as if the universe was arranging for the most important people in Maria's life to converge at the same location where her understanding of courage and service had been forever altered. "I want to meet him," Carlos had written about Jake. "I want to thank the man who protected my mother and to learn from someone who exemplifies everything I'm trying to become as a soldier. He risked his life for someone he didn't know, using skills I'm still developing for reasons that connect directly to why I serve." Maria had been promoted within the civilian workforce, partly in recognition of her service during the attack, but also because her experience had given her insights into security and safety that made her valuable in planning and training roles. She now helped develop protocols for civilian workers and consulted on security improvements, transforming her trauma into expertise that protected others. The work was meaningful in ways her previous job had never been, directly connected to the safety and security mission rather than simply supporting it through maintenance tasks. She felt more integrated into the military community, more appreciated for her contributions, and more aware of how her daily work connected to larger purposes. The anniversary of the attack approached with careful planning for facility leadership, who understood that the date would be emotionally significant for everyone involved. Rather than ignoring the difficult memories, they had decided to mark the occasion with a ceremony honoring civilian resilience and military protection, recognizing both Maria's courage and Jake's heroism while acknowledging the broader lessons learned. "We want to commemorate this as an example of what makes America strong," the commanding officer had explained to Maria during planning discussions. "The willingness of trained warriors to protect innocent people, the courage of civilians under attack, and the community that emerges when people support each other through crisis. These are values worth celebrating and remembering." Maria had agreed to speak at the ceremony, though public speaking terrified her almost as much as the attack had. Her remarks would focus not on the violence she had survived, but on the protection she had received, the community that had supported her recovery, and the enhanced sense of purpose that had emerged from trauma. She wanted to honor Jake's heroism while also acknowledging the broader network of people who had helped her heal. Jake would be returning from deployment 2 days before the anniversary ceremony. His timing adjusted specifically to allow his participation in the commemoration. Maria felt nervous about seeing him again, uncertain whether their written correspondence had created realistic expectations for their in-person interaction. The man who had saved her life through violence might be very different from the thoughtful correspondent who had supported her recovery through words. The night before Jake's return, Maria stood in the supply building one final time as the civilian worker she had been before the attack. Tomorrow, everything would change again as she took on expanded responsibilities that reflected her evolved understanding of service and community. The broom that had symbolized her simple duties still leaned in the storage room, but she knew she would never see it the same way again. Her phone rang as she prepared to leave the facility, and she was surprised to see that the call was from Carlos, whose unit was not scheduled to have communication privileges for another week. His voice was excited and slightly breathless, carrying news that would complete the transformation of her world in ways she could never have anticipated. "Mom, I have 48 hours of emergency leave approved. I'll be there for the ceremony, and I'll be there to meet Staff Sergeant Morrison. My commanding officer arranged it after hearing about the anniversary event. He said that some connections are too important to leave to chance, and that the military takes care of its own, including family members who've shown exceptional courage." Maria felt tears starting as she realized that the people most important to her would all be together at the place where her life had changed forever. The attack had been intended to create fear and destruction, but instead it had forged connections and revealed strengths that made everyone involved more resilient and more committed to protecting each other. As she walked to her car under the same sky, where helicopters had brought both danger and rescue, Maria understood that she was no longer the same person who had arrived for work that morning 3 months ago with nothing more significant on her mind than completing routine maintenance tasks. She had become someone who understood viscerally the connections between individual courage and collective security, between personal service and larger purposes, between ordinary people and extraordinary circumstances. Tomorrow would bring reunions that would define new chapters in relationships forged through crisis. Jake would return as both hero and friend. Carlos would arrive as son and fellow servant, and Maria would stand among them not as victim, but as survivor, contributor, and integral member of a community dedicated to protecting what mattered most. The simple act of sweeping floors had led to profound discoveries about the nature of courage, service, and the unbreakable bonds that form when people risk everything to protect each other.